Good evening, everyone. It is great to see such a wonderful crowd here today. Thank you for joining us. We have people from all over the world, including South Africa, Australia, Texas, Washington, Hawaii, Arizona, Virginia, Wisconsin, all kinds of folks from all over the country, and of course, many people here right here in the Berkshires. We're so glad to have you join us. My name is Megan Wilden, and it is an honor and delight to be the Executive Director of OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkshire Community College. As many of you know, we were honored to have Jim Acosta as our speaker for the 10th annual Mona Sherman Memorial Lecture, which was held at the beautiful Mahawi Performing Arts Center in Great Barrington just over a year ago, and he was wonderful. I'm sure many of you here in the Berkshires were there for that. We're so delighted to welcome him back 1 year later, one impeachment later, and one pandemic later, to hear his perspective on everything that's happened over the past year. And we're delighted that he will be in conversation with our own Kevin Moran, who is the executive editor of the Berkshire Eagle here in Western Massachusetts. For those who don't know, and I also want to give a big thank you and shout out to our own Berkshire Gas, who is sponsoring today's talk. Thank you to everyone there. I know there's some folks here from Berkshire Gas, so thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your support and for being here and for encouraging thoughtful conversation in our community. For those who don't know, OLLI at BCC provides educational, social, and volunteer opportunities designed especially by and for people 50 years old and up. We have over 1,300 members and produce over 120 different programs a year, from classes in science and literature to distinguished speakers, special events, and more. If you are not yet a member, I encourage you to consider joining. And I know actually that there's also OLLI members from all over the country from different OLLIs who are with us tonight too. So welcome to our fellow OLLI out there. We are starting our second summer semester of online classes on Monday, July 13th, and those can be enjoyed from wherever you are. We use Zoom for the classes and have outstanding instructors in a variety of topics, no tests, no grades, just learning for the love of learning. You can find out more at our website at www.berkshireolli.org. It is my great pleasure to introduce Lisa Sharkey tonight. She is Mona Sherman's daughter of the Mona Sherman Memorial Lecture and has been instrumental in bringing extraordinary speakers to OLLI at BCC, and we're so happy to share them with you. Lisa is Senior Vice President and Director of Creative Development for HarperCollins Publishers, where she has acquired and overseen the editing of more than 40 New York Times bestsellers. He always has amazing books in the pipeline, and I'm particularly looking forward to the memoir by the late great Congressman Elijah Cummings entitled We're Better Than This, which will be coming out in September. Watch for it. Before her success in book publishing, she held executive positions in television with Good Morning America, Inside Edition, and more, winning 2 Emmy Awards, and was part of the Peabody and DuPont award-winning team at ABC News that covered the events surrounding September 11th. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Sharkey to the Zoom stage.
Hi there, I don't know if you guys can see me. It says unable to start video.
I'm not sure why that is.
Here we go. Okay. Hi there. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much, Megan, for that wonderful introduction. I am so excited to be introducing one of my favorite people who is now able to reach many more people than could ever have fit in the Mahawi in Great Barrington, where Jim delivered an impassioned talk to a completely packed audience a year ago May for the 10th annual Mona Sherman Memorial Lecture, named for my wonderful mom, Mona, who was a former president of BILL, which is the predecessor to OLLI at BCC. Wow, how the world has changed since 2008, when Mom was so excited to be voting for Barack Obama. Unfortunately, she never got the chance. She suddenly passed away just a few weeks before the election. And how the world has radically turned upside down since last May, when we were able to breathe in the spring air and smell the lilacs with our nostrils unobstructed, and dined indoors with abandon and all had perfectly coiffed hair. We could never have predicted that we'd all be here, nestled in our homes, wearing masks outside the house, please wear your masks, and facing the potential re-election in a few months of a president who is called our guest tonight, my author and the author of The Enemy of the People, The Enemy of the People. Jim Acosta was covering Barack Obama back in 2008, and he's covered the White House for CNN, both in that infamous briefing room and from locations around the globe, with award-winning dogged determination, just like the outstanding reporter that he is. Jim had already made a name for himself, more than just a name for himself, when we met. And I just want to tell you a little bit of a backstory of how the book happened. So in my role at HarperCollins, I oversee the acquisitions of very high-profile nonfiction books. And sometimes I acquire books by people who don't even know they're writing a book for HarperCollins until I call them. Well, as you know, Jim Acosta pulls no punches when it comes for fighting for truth and justice and the First Amendment and the right for journalists to ask the tough questions and demand truth in those answers. So one day, about 2 years ago, I am a news junkie, having been in the news business, and I was scrolling through my news feed, and I saw this unbelievable exchange in the White House briefing room between Jim and Sarah Huckabee Sanders, when Jim asked Sarah to state unequivocally that the press was not the enemy of the people, and she refused to do so. So I watched the exchange again this afternoon, and Jim says to Sarah, quote, "I think it would be a good thing if you would say right here at this briefing to the people who are gathered right now, who are doing their jobs every day, asking questions of officials like the ones you brought forward earlier, are not the enemy of the people. We deserve that." And Sanders would not agree to say those words. And I was floored, frankly, not only by her response, but by Jim's unwavering commitment to fight for the rights of journalists to do their jobs without presidential harassment. For journalists all over the world, and scarily now in the United States of America, these are really dangerous times. As a journalist myself, of course, it was outrageous and upsetting, but I felt good because Jim, who won the 2019 Truth to Power Award from the prestigious New York Press Club, not to mention numerous other accolades, from the Presidential Award from the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and Emmy Awards, he was there in the room protecting the First Amendment with his presence and his persistence. I immediately called a friend of mine at CNN and I asked for Jim's cell phone number, and we met up. And of course, the result is that Jim had already thought about writing a book and had begun to write a few things. And The Enemy of the People came out. It became an instant New York Times bestseller when the hardcover came out last June. But of course, the story didn't end with the publication of Jim's book. And so for the paperback, he added an entirely new chapter about the impeachment. But the story still didn't end. Hopefully it will. And so much has happened since then. And Jim, unlike the way he has been sometimes portrayed by presidents and trolls alike, is one of the most polite, kind, and thoughtful high-profile authors I've ever worked with. We really enjoyed having him up in the Berkshires last Memorial Day weekend with my stepfather, Art Sherman, and Enid Michaelman. And we're always hosting our speakers, and we always have such a great time with them. And so, Art, if you're watching right now, please submit your questions. The Berkshire Eagle, of course, stands for everything that Jim Acosta stands for, which is why I'm so excited that Executive Editor Kevin Moran will be in conversation with Jim tonight, following some brief remarks by Jim about his new book. After that, I'll be moderating questions and answers from you, the audience, and you'll be able to post those questions, and I'll go through them, and I'll ask as many as I can before the night is over. A bit more about Kevin and about the Berkshire Eagle. The Berkshire Eagle returned to local ownership in 2016, and the newspaper has done amazingly well. I call it the soaring Berkshire Eagle. It's won Newspaper of the Year, General Excellence Awards from the New England Newspaper and Press Association. And Kevin is an amazing guy. He's been a native of Western Mass. He's been in journalism since 1993. He's been managing editor of newspapers in Massachusetts and Vermont. He's a past president of the New England Associated Press News Executives Association, and he mentors foreign journalists with Alfred Friendly Press Partners. Not to mention, I hear he plays mean guitar in a punk rock band called The Damaged. So maybe we'll get a taste of that another time. Clearly, though, we are all feeling damaged as a country right now from a global pandemic, a history of racism, and so many other things that we will be discussing shortly. Before Kevin interviews Jim, I just want Jim to have a quick opportunity to talk to you all briefly about his experience in the Berkshires last year and why he felt it was so important to update his book. So Jim Acosta, thank you so much for agreeing to this virtual event where more than probably up to 1,300 people at this point have signed up, which is a record number, more than twice the number of people who could have fit inside the theater in Great Barrington. We are so honored that you are taking time out of your much needed week off at CNN to spend the next 90 minutes with us. So I applaud you, and take it away, Jim and Kevin.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. For some reason, video is slow. If you can turn on your video, that'd be awesome. Oh, there you are.
Does that work?
It does, it does.
Terrific. Hey, thanks so much for being here, everybody who's tuning in. As Lisa was just talking about, and Megan was just talking about, this is a new experience for all of us. You know, it's a little strange and unusual to be doing a book talk via Zoom, but hopefully we can all hang in there, roll with the punches if there are any technical problems. And I will tell you, and I've said this to Lisa many times, the event up in the Berkshires last year was a highlight of my book rollout for The Enemy of the People. It was sort of in anticipation of the book coming out, as I recall, Lisa. We were there a few weeks before it came out. And as it so often happens in the book world, the book leaked. And that weekend, the Guardian newspaper, I guess, got a copy of it, and they were starting to put out some headlines from the book. And I think I remember the headline being, "The President's Insane," was the headline in the Guardian about what they had pulled out of the book before its actual rollout date. And that is because we had a White House official who told me this, and I relayed this in the book, that, you know, he thought the president could be a bit much at times, to be diplomatic about it, and said to me point blank, "The president's insane," one time. I've heard some interesting anecdotes from senior White House officials since then. We could talk about some of this. But, you know, the main reason why I wrote this book, and the reason why I wanted to come up to the Berkshires, and I'm excited to talk about it every chance that I get, is because I don't want us to live in a country where the press is deemed by the President of the United States, of all people, the enemy of the people. I grew up in this business the old-fashioned way. I started in local news, worked my way up to CNN, where I am today as the chief White House correspondent. But I worked in Knoxville, Tennessee. I worked in Dallas, Texas. I worked in Chicago. Worked in New York for CBS News, and then in Atlanta for CBS News, and then moved over to CNN and was in CNN in New York, and then in Washington. So, you know, as Johnny Cash would say, I've been everywhere. But, you know, one of the things that I never ran across throughout all my travels as a reporter was a president, or really any political leader in this country, referring to the press as the enemy of the people, or fake news, or all of the different things that he says about us. The thing that I get concerned about, and I think we can talk about some of this tonight, you know, I think we're seeing the culmination of some of the damage that's been done to the First Amendment, to the institution of a free press in this country, when you have a president go after the press in ways that delegitimize the national news media to millions and millions of Americans, to the point now where so many Americans don't believe what we're saying about a deadly pandemic, about the seriousness of the coronavirus. They're happy to go about doing their shopping and going to restaurants and bars without masks on and so on. And a lot of that is because they don't trust what the national news media is saying. And our critics will say, aha, that's because of you, Jim, or people like you. But I would argue that, you know, a large part of this is because of the demonization of the press that we've seen happened out on the campaign trail when Donald Trump was a candidate for president, and also in the White House. You know, there's one point in the book, early on in the book, I talk about how, you know, there were senior White House officials, White House aides, campaign people who would tell me, oh, Jim, it's just an act. And there was a press conference that we had in February 2017 where Hope Hicks, the president's communications director, called me on the phone after a press conference and said, Jim, I just want you to know, the president and I just spoke, and the president wanted you to know that he thinks Jim gets it. Jim really gets it. And I thought to myself, what does he mean he gets it? It all goes back to, in the very beginning of this administration, you know, this was kind of a shtick for him. This was kind of an act for him. And the problem for all of us is many of his supporters don't see it as a shtick. They don't see it as an act. They see this as real life itself, as real as the coronavirus, I suppose, for a lot of people. And compounding that problem is the fact that this president, throughout the first 3 to 4 years of his administration, has just routinely attacked the press to the extent that, as I was saying earlier, people just don't trust what we say anymore. And I think we're now seeing some very destructive consequences of that. And so we can get into all of these issues, but I just wanted to open with that. And I look forward to your questions, and I'll turn it over to Kevin. He and I had a conversation about some of this the other day for the Berkshire Eagle, which is a fabulous local paper. If you don't subscribe to a local paper, you should. You should definitely do that. Don't try to get your news for free off of social media and so on. Subscribe to a newspaper, listen to the radio, listen to your NPR station, subscribe to magazines that will enlighten you. Try to get all points of view. And of course, watch us at CNN. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kevin. I'm sure there's a lot that I wanted to say in my opening that I didn't say. But we've got a lot of time to talk about all these things.
Well, listen, thank you, Megan. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, Jim Acosta, the CNN chief White House correspondent. And seriously, welcome back to the Berkshires, albeit it's virtual. And really, congratulations on the book, In the Enemy of the People, as we mark just over a year since the release. And we now see its release in paperback with an updated afterword that I'd love to get into a little bit. And the afterword, of course, captures a number of notable events that have taken place since the book's original publication. And even then, there's plenty to talk about since the afterword was even authored, as far as that's concerned. But seriously, if I can we just go back for a moment to Wednesday, November 7th, 2018. Yeah. It's one of the most remarkable and hostile press conferences of President Trump's presidency. President Trump lashes out at journalists, and you in particular, calling you, and you're not this, a rude, terrible person, unquote, after you asked whether he was demonizing immigrants because he was calling the Central American migrants who were making their way up north a, quote, an invasion. And hours later, you learned that the White House has suspended your press credentials. When you heard that, what was the first thing that went through your mind? And if you can't say what the first thing was, then maybe you can say what the second thing was.
Yeah, I mean, there were a number of words that went through my mind at that point. One of the things that I thought about immediately was, well, this could be the end of my career. I mean, they were playing for keeps at that point. When you take away somebody's press pass, people may not understand this clearly as I do, but I use my press pass to get into the White House every day. It gives me easy access. I go through Secret Service, bing, bang, boom. 2 minutes later, I'm in the White House North Lawn grounds, and I'm heading into the briefing room, which is open to the press. When you take that away, you are restricting their access to their beat. If I were covering Capitol Hill and all of a sudden the Capitol Police said you can't come on the grounds of the Capitol, that is essentially what happened. And just to show you or give you an example of what happened that night, I was coming back from dinner. I went out and grabbed something to eat. Hours earlier, I had that confrontation with the president where the intern tried to take my microphone away. We all remember that. And I looked down at my phone, and there's an email from Sarah Huckabee Sanders. It's not to me, it's to the entire world. And it says, because of what Jim did at the press conference earlier today, we are suspending his hard pass. And, I walk up to the Secret Service booth, and I see this head poke out of the booth, like, uh-oh, it's him. And they come up to me and they say, listen, you're not allowed to come in here. You need to hand us your press pass. And so the first thought that really that jumped into my head was, I need to get this on video. I need to document this. So I pulled out my phone, was recording this, and that way they couldn't say afterwards, oh, Jim, you should have seen the way he behaved with these Secret Service agents. He was abusive. He was saying all of these things. I wanted to make sure that it was captured for all posterity and memorialized that I've been very professional and very polite to the Secret Service agent. Lisa mentioned that I'm polite. I'm pretty much polite all the time, and I try to be polite with the Secret Service. And, you know, after that, Sarah Sanders doubled down. You'll recall she put out a different tweet later on that night and said that we stand by our decision to do this. And oh, by the way, here's the reason why. And it, you know, attached to that tweet was that infamous doctored video of, you know, my you know, confrontation, I guess you would call it, or altercation, you could call it, with the White House intern taking away my microphone. And it was sped up, and there were some frames removed, digitally altered, so it looked like I was karate chopping the intern's arm, which in fact I didn't do. We may have brushed past each other because she was grabbing my microphone and so on, not to go down that rabbit hole. But it was striking because, you know, Sarah had used a video that the White House had grabbed from InfoWars, which is a notorious conspiracy theory driven website that has been thoroughly discredited for various and sundry reasons. They tried to say that the Sandy Hook school shooting was a hoax and so on. For people who don't know what InfoWars is, I don't want you to go to the website and encourage what they do, but it's a highly discredited conspiracy theory driven website. The fact that a White House press secretary, a government employee paid for with our tax dollars, whose salary is paid for with our tax dollars, would think it's okay to put a doctored video on social media to justify the revocation of a hard pass, to me, is just unbelievable. Fortunately, CNN felt the same way. Our parent company, AT&T, felt the same way. And we decided to take the administration to court. And Kevin, we can talk about that further. There were some massive implications in that court case. You know, and I talk about this in the book. You know, the administration was arguing in federal court that the president of the United States can pick and choose who covers the White House. That was the argument that they were trying to make. Totally ludicrous. Fortunately, a Trump-appointed judge took our side in all of this, but it illustrated, I think, not just for me, but for the entire White House press corps, DC press corps, and I think much of the world, what Donald Trump and his team thought of the First Amendment in this country, and that it is subject to the whims of the President of the United States. And we just can't have a situation like that in this country, Republican or Democrat. You know, people say, oh, it's Jim, it's because you're an activist or you're an advocate or you're in the tank for Obama or you're in the tank for this person or that person. No, we need to have a baseline rule in this country, and that is the press has largely unfettered access to the President of the United States to do the coverage that we need to do to cover the president. He is the president. He's paid for with our tax dollars. He commands a large part of the federal bureaucracy. He essentially controls the federal bureaucracy. All of that has to be covered. And you can't have the president willy-nilly or his team willy-nilly saying, well, we don't like that person's coverage or we don't like that outlet's coverage. And that was what was at stake in that case. You could have had, you know, if it had been ruled against us, you could have had governors and mayors and governments around the country saying, we want to kick out this newspaper, we want to kick out that TV station because we don't like what that reporter did or that photographer did. We want to kick them all out so we can do it our way. We just want to have Fox News in here and OAN. We just can't have a situation like that in this country. We can explore some of those things if you'd like, but that was, to me, a large part of what was at stake in that whole situation.
Well, absolutely, and I think it's worth reminding viewers that that action, pulling your hard pass, as far as I know, was unprecedented up until that point.
That's right.
And that, to me, I think to journalists across the nation, really sent a cold, a chilling effect across all of our newsrooms and, you know, democracy-loving, journalism-loving, you know, citizens everywhere. I think it also had the same effect. And to furthermore, I think you're exactly right that when Sarah Huckabee Sanders retweeted the doctored video, that was quite disturbing as well. And it was actually unfathomable and surreal, you know, but to some people that, you know, that day enshrined Jim Acosta as the, you know, poster child for the First Amendment and defender of the freedom of the press. And to others, it only cemented their notion of the press as the enemy of the people and Jim Acosta's enemy number one. I mean, I don't think you were looking to take on either role from either perspective in this, but that's where you landed. When it comes to people in the first group, in other words, you know, people who are behind you and appreciate the freedom of the press and would find it unfathomable that a hard pass would be pulled from a White House corps member. But some wonder why White House reporters maybe don't follow up on each other's questions or follow up on their colleagues' questions when President Trump answers with, you know, obvious distortions and inaccuracies, and or when he makes an ad hominem or rude comment about the reporter and his or her organization. You know, it's understood that reporters have his or her own list of questions they want answered, but in the long run, would more truth come out if reporters persisted on getting answers and pushing back when their colleagues are treated rudely?
I think so. I think we could do more of that. I think to some extent, one of the problems that we've had is we haven't been a united front. And, you know, there are some pitfalls to that. One is you could have a situation where, you know, you kind of don't want reporters to conspire with one another to come up with questions. And to some extent, it's a good, healthy process that everybody's sort of coming up with their own questions. But I do think, in the spirit of what you're talking about, we need to make sure we're not letting the person who's being asked the question off the hook, whether it be the president or the White House press secretary. And I do think you've seen more of that lately. You know, I think as you've seen people like Yamiche Alcindor, Weijia Zhang, Caitlin Collins, my colleague at CNN, or Jeremy Diamond, my colleague at CNN, you're seeing Peter Alexander, my colleague at NBC, who write about in the book, who defended me that day, as a matter of fact, at that infamous press conference in November of 2018. You are starting to see us collectively try to hold their feet to the fire a lot more than we did at the beginning of the administration. And I think one of the reasons is that it's dawned on many of us, and it's dawned on our editors and our bosses, which obviously, as you know, Kevin, makes it a better situation for the reporter on the ground or in the room to engage if you have those people behind you. It's dawned on everybody what the threats are now, that now that they've gone after my press pass and they've gone after Brian Karem's press pass, and they've not just insulted me, but they've insulted 10 of my different colleagues, we sort of have a better sense of what the game is now. Now we understand that it's a little bit of divide and conquer. You know, as I write about in the book, the president has tried mightily from day one of his administration to pit one group of Americans against another, whether it be people in the Midwest against immigrants, Republicans versus Democrat, mask wearers versus non-mask wearers, and so on. To some extent, during the beginning days of the administration, beginning months and a couple of years of the administration, it was pitting news outlet against news outlet, journalist against journalist. And, you know, I think to some extent we've come to this realization now that if we don't hang together, we might hang separately. And we do have to work collectively, to the extent that we have to make sure that they're not being let off the hook. I think if we were to get in a room and say, okay, you asked this question and I asked that question, first of all, that's never going to work. As Kevin knows, journalists are, you know, we're competitive with one another. We're our own adversaries before we're adversaries with the president, obviously, or any politician. And so to some extent that works against us working together in the way that you're talking about. But I do think the sense of camaraderie, the sense that we're in it together, the sense that there's a common purpose, that we're now after the truth more so than we have perhaps ever that I can recall in my career, when you have a president who's uttered some 18,000 false or misleading statements according to the Washington Post since coming into office. There's a recognition now that what the president initially says may not be in line with the facts, or what the White House press secretary says, no matter who that White House press secretary is, may be performing for the man behind the curtain and not really for the American people and giving them the straight scoop. And so that recognition has taken time to get us to where we are now. That process has taken some time to get us to where we are now. But I think it's a good, healthy place that we're in heading into these final months of the campaign, because you can't BS people about a pandemic. You can't BS people about a virus. You can't say the virus is going to disappear, or that it's going to go away when it gets warmer out. And then when it doesn't happen, you know, we can all say, wait a minute, Mr. President, back in March, back in April, you were saying it was going to end. It was going to be over in April. That didn't happen. What's going on here? So the facts have been on our side as well. As the facts have come in, and as we've seen the truth, I think, be revealed over time, it has strengthened the spines of a lot of journalists and a lot of news outlets in ways that I think are serving us much better than when we first got into this.
By the same token, is it possible to convert, or I don't know, persuade otherwise those who consider we journalists to be the enemies of the people? Do we have any ground there? And just to add on, do you think that maybe the pandemic, us reporting the truth about the pandemic, as you were saying, and over the arc of it, lends to our credibility once and for all? Because in some ways the pandemic is political, but in other ways it's physical. It's killing people and making them sick.
Well, one of the things that I've noticed during this pandemic is, because we've had to hold the president's feet to the fire and we've had to be tough on him, there has been that resulting backlash that I've seen, that I've witnessed since the beginning of this administration. I've gotten death threats. I've seen threatening messages come in on my social media accounts. People have, put out messages on other people's social media accounts where they tag me and they'll say, Jim is the enemy of the people, or we can't wait until Jim gets his. I had to talk to the FBI a couple of months ago about some death threats that were taking place. As I chronicle throughout the book, this has been part of the deal since the beginning of this administration. And it's unfortunate. I'm not the only one. Colleagues of mine, counterparts of mine at various news outlets have had to deal with this. And we've gotten to a place in this country where this has been normalized. This has been sanitized. And, if we get to a point where we think it's okay to talk about journalists in this fashion, my fear is that one day we'll see a journalist seriously injured or killed in this country. And the day that happens, we cease being the United States of America that we all grew up with, the country that I grew up in. A journalist could go to a presidential rally and not worry about his or her safety. These days, I have to go in with bodyguards. Towards the end of that 2018 midterm cycle, I needed, I was given 4 or 5 bodyguards to various events because of the threats that were coming in. And is this something that we like to talk about in the press? No, we don't want to talk about it. Is this something that everybody's comfortable talking about? No, but I felt, one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book is I felt the public had a right to know about this, because this to me is emblematic of what is happening to your country. If it's okay to demonize the press to the point where people could get killed, then you have a serious problem. Remember, there was a man named Cesar Sayoc, self-described Trump supporter, who sent pipe bombs to CNN. So this is not theoretical stuff. Getting back to your question about the invasion of migrants, there was the El Paso shooter. Remember, that El Paso shooter wrote in his manifesto that he wanted to stop a so-called invasion. So we have seen a track record of a cause and effect of language coming from the White House, coming from the president, and things that have happened in the real world. And that is why we have said so many times, words matter. So can we persuade people not to think that way about us? I think one of the problems that we're going to be experiencing, whether or not Donald Trump wins re-election, and even if he loses re-election, I think we might experience this more critically. You may see people not wanting to give up on that mentality, and it may take time for us to get back to that baseline of normalcy where we don't demonize journalists in that fashion. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, and I don't think there's a magic formula or a secret recipe for it, barring some kind of cataclysmic, horrendous tragedy that shakes people out of this mentality. It just may take time.
For what it's worth, I do see and fear, but also see sort of a trickle-down effect, because I do think that the president, in the way that he treats the press, gives others on a more, statewide or even local level license to be cavalier with the press, to ignore the press. And I think, as we've seen, reported on CNN and of course national media, it's not only local politicians who feel that license, but to some extent, sometimes even people who are authority figures. And that's I think a harmful and chilling effect, because I think in essence, yes, we get paid to ask questions, but we get paid to ask questions on behalf of the American people. And if that stops, then it's the people who will suffer. Look, I understand too that you've been off the past couple days, but the Supreme Court of late has issued some opinions that don't necessarily roll the president's way, including today when the court ruled that the president's personal tax returns can be made available to prosecutors in New York. Setback for the president, and will reporters be able to see and get their hands on those financial records? And I understand that they have prevented Congress from accessing those records, if I have that correct.
Yeah, it was kind of a split decision to some extent. I mean, one of the things that made this a landmark decision is, in the cases of Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton, where the courts have sided with public disclosures in investigations of presidents. That is essentially what the Supreme Court said today, and it was a 7-2 decision, I believe, that said that the president does not have blanket immunity to these sorts of things. And if there's a legitimate law enforcement or even congressional purpose for seeking presidential records or documents, that the president must turn those documents or records over. And that is consistent with what happened with Richard Nixon and the Watergate tapes and Bill Clinton and the Monica Lewinsky investigation. And, what is problematic for the president right now is what is happening in the Southern District of New York. You have prosecutors in New York on the state and federal level, I should point out, not just Southern District, but state and federal investigators who are working on investigations, what we believe to be active investigations. Some of this is an offshoot of the Michael Cohen, Stormy Daniels case, which we don't need to get into. Most people hopefully know about that and can Google it if they don't know. But that, as we all know, the president was tied into that investigation. And so, yes, of course, financial records, tax records are going to be essential in figuring out exactly what happened there. If there were payoffs going to people before the 2016 election in order to conceal things that the president didn't want revealed at that time, or candidate Trump didn't want revealed at that time, that's all germane in an investigation. It sounds as though what the Supreme Court did is it kicked it back to the lower courts to sort of lay out a roadmap for prosecutors to follow in terms of doing that. The one thing that I think is beneficial to the president is that records are not going to be going to congressional investigators, it seems, at this point. And it seems that because of the timetable and the practical, process of, these sorts of things working their way through the courts, it's unlikely that the president's tax records will be revealed before the November election. More than anything else, that may be what, carries the day in this argument. That, if the president does not have to reveal his tax records before the November election, then he has dodged a major, problem that would have been coming his way had he had to reveal those tax records. If his tax records had come out and shown that he has been, and we know some of this because some of those tax records have been produced, that, he's essentially been doing everything in his power to avoid paying taxes, that is not going to be beneficial to him politically. But we don't know that to be the case. Ironclad 100%. A lot of people suspect that's the case. And worse, as the case may be. But without the actual documents, we can't say, aha, here you go, this is what he was doing. And that may be what has benefited him more than anything, even though the court essentially ruled against him.
Yeah, along these lines, in your afterword, which appears in paperback form in the media of People, and I might mention that it is also on the electronic book format too, as well. The afterword appears, but in the afterword, you write that President Trump was, quote, genuinely shocked when the Ukraine scandal was leading to his impeachment, and that a couple of his advisors joked to me being you, that Trump had done worse things as president. You know, if anything, Trump is a fighter. He's lucky. And after lies and scandals and quote, worse things, Trump is a candidate who, by most accounts, runs the White House in re-election mode. And time again, he takes dents to his presidency, and even being branded an impeached president hasn't necessarily made him vulnerable in seeking re-election. And as you wrote in your afterword, it made some commentators muse that perhaps Trump could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and get away with it, provided he had a Republican jury. But I think I'm curious to know, the coronavirus and Black Lives Matter appear to be significant adversaries for President Trump right now. Yeah.
I think they've been more damaging to him than the Ukraine scandal. No question about it. The coronavirus pandemic has, I think, done more damage to this president than really anything during his 4 years in office. And it may happen that, you know, we'll see an election decided on his handling of a pandemic, which who would have seen that coming? Nobody saw that coming. And so I think that I do think one of the reasons why, you know, I wanted to write this afterward, and, you know, they approached me, and unfortunately I didn't get to include a lot of the stuff about the pandemic in there, except that I do mention that, you know, he resumed calling us the enemy of the people again because of his frustration with our coverage of the pandemic. He had stopped calling us the enemy of the people for a while and then started back up again because he didn't like our coverage of the pandemic. Putting that to the side, though, the Ukraine scandal to me really crystallized his, I think, worldview. And his worldview is quid pro quo, this for that. If you do this for me, I'll do that for you. And what I tried to, and you can go through the Ukraine saga until the cows come home. Alexander Vindman, John Bolton, all of these different characters in that drama. One afterward is not enough to tackle the whole subject, although I did my best to wrap my arms around it. But the point I wanted to make at the very end of the book is that, unlike the president, we are not a quid pro quo country. That's not how I view the United States of America. To me, the United States of America is much more than some boardroom deal where I scratch your back and you scratch my back. That's not what's going to get us through something like a global pandemic. That's not what's going to get us through racial unrest in this country, the police brutality problem that has existed for far too long in our country. There's no quid pro quo that is going to solve any of those things. And, you know, what dawned on me as I was writing this afterward was something that I saw etched into the Resolute desk in the Oval Office one day as I was, you know, throwing in one of my tough questions that I try mightily to craft to throw them off as talking points. And etched into the Resolute desk in the Oval Office, it says "E pluribus unum," our traditional national motto in this country: out of one, many. And as I write in the book, you know, it has its roots. Its roots go back to Cicero, who essentially said, I'm not quoting this word for word, that if we love one another as a country or as a people, you know, you can be one out of many. And in many ways, I think what we've become in this country is out of one, many. We, instead of one country, we are bits and pieces of a country. We are millennials and baby boomers and Gen Xers. We are white, black, Latino. We are gay or straight. We are not one country in the way that I think of this country, you know, being here for almost 50 years now. I don't want to say it out loud too loudly, but, and that to me is, that's a problem. And it's one of the reasons why I think Donald Trump has been so effective at exploiting the divisions in this country, because we've pulled ourselves back into these various corners. And one of the reasons why we've not been able to tackle this pandemic is we've pulled back into these corners. We believe in masks or we don't believe in masks. We believe in shutting down for the greater good, or, you know, we want to live and let live. And if I want to go to a bar and get 20 people sick, so be it. You know, we can't operate like that and be the strongest, most prosperous country in the world that respects people's differences and freedoms and liberties. I just don't think that that's feasible. And so one of the things that I try to end on in this book is this getting back to this notion, and George Washington over my shoulder right there, who talked about this, that we can't let excessive partisanship, we can't let internal divisions tear us apart to the point where we can't solve common problems. And I think that is where we are as a country right now. It is why we've been divided up by the president and his team so artfully over the last few years. And I think it's one of the reasons why we have not gotten on top of this pandemic. We have not done it with one common purpose, as one people, as one country. And I think it's why we're in the fix that we're in. So I hope, even though there's not a long dissertation on the coronavirus at the end of this book, it does talk about some of these general themes that if we don't get a handle on some of these problems of being just so deeply divided and pulled apart, I think we're going to regret it in the years to come.
What do you think might have happened or would have happened if Congress had known about President Trump's knowledge of Russian President Vladimir Putin's dollars for dog tags bounties back when they started the impeachment on the Ukrainian pressure issue? I mean, sure, the House would have included that as part of the impeachment, and
absolutely,
would they have gotten more than just Mitt Romney to vote to remove in the Senate?
Honestly, I think that one of the things, and I talk about this a great deal in the book, one of the, and as you know, Kevin, you follow this very closely, one of the things that we're going to be seeing, I think, over the next 5 to 10, 15 years, when we look back on this period, is how the Republican Party just did not pump the brakes on this president. And that's putting it mildly. I'm being diplomatic right now, maybe because I'm off this week. But, I don't know if you would have gotten enough votes to convict in the Senate, even knowing all of the details of the bounty scandal. And, if there weren't a deadly pandemic going on, that bounty scandal would be on every night, the lead story every night. We'd be talking about it every night. But I go back to what John Bolton would have been able to tell the American people. If he had gone out there and testified during this impeachment saga instead of waiting for his book to come out, what stories would he have told? Republicans in the Senate would have been looking at a neocon's neocon. You can't challenge John Bolton's Republican bona fides. It's just impossible. You may challenge his Trump loyalty bona fide, sure. And as I write in the afterword, as a Republican operative told me, this is not the Republican Party anymore. This is the Trump Party. This is not a Republican administration anymore. This is the Trump administration. And that, I think, sums up where we are right now as a country. As long as you have one party that is ride or die, Thumb and Louise, with the President of the United States, I don't know what you could throw at them at this point. I think this pandemic has shown divisions in ways that we haven't seen before. Mitch McConnell has come out and said, wear a mask, and John Thune has said, well, maybe they need to work on their rhetoric at the White House. But that's not exactly like, strapping the president to a chair and, giving him the business and telling him to clean up his act. I mean, there just hasn't really been a willingness inside the Republican Party to challenge this president in any sort of way. And I think until that day comes, there's not much that's going to be done in the bounds of the Constitution in terms of impeachment or whatever. I think this is an electoral decision that's going to be made by the American people. We have just a few months to go before November 3rd. And I think people are going to have to make that decision for themselves as to whether or not, the president deserves another 4 years in office. It's funny, every 4 years or every election, the question is posed to the American people. It's sort of that old Ronald Reagan question. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? The question that probably should be asked now is, can you take 4 more years of this? And that ultimately, I think, is going to be the question that most voters are going to be taking into the voting booth. Can they take 4 more years of this? And I think that's going to determine the election.
So Mary Trump's book is coming out, I believe, this coming Tuesday. And as you mentioned, John Bolton's book came out a couple of weeks ago. Obviously, they'll have no effect on an impeachment process. But, and numerous books have been written about the president. And you would think any one of those books would have seriously damaged a presidency, but they seemingly haven't necessarily done that.
Right.
But do you think that the publication of these particular books, especially when the Trump administration fought so hard to keep them from being published, will have an effect on the voters?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that, well, maybe on the voters, not on the Republican Party, but on the voters, to some extent, yes. One of the problems that Donald Trump has, and we saw this in the 2018 midterms, is with suburban female voters in swing districts. I remember on election night during those midterms talking to an aide to a Republican congressional leader whose name will not be mentioned here, saying to me how Donald Trump's immigration crusade against the caravan and so on just damaged the Republicans in these swing districts, and particularly with suburban women. And one of the, I think, problems that the president has sensed and his family has sensed in trying to stop this book is that, Mary Trump has some very deeply personal things that she is saying that I think is not going to help his cause with that slice of the electorate. So I do think that that is a big worry for him, no question about it. Will it tip the election? That remains to be seen. But remember, Donald Trump won by a slim margin in Pennsylvania, a slim margin in Michigan, a slim margin in Wisconsin. That blue wall that appeals, that Joe Biden appeals to, I think, and to a large extent. And I think that's one reason why, Donald Trump was going after Joe Biden so much with this, this Ukraine matter. They sense what he can do in those states and what he's capable of doing in those states. So any slice of the onion either way could tip the election. And if a Mary Trump book comes out and damages him with female voters to the extent that it, shifts one state to one side or the other, yeah, sure, it could have an effect.
We have a few minutes left to our conversation, and I know that there are plenty of questions that our viewers have as well. So let me, if I may, do a couple rapid fire questions. How about, there's been some speculation that President Trump might dump Vice President Pence and replace him with somebody more charismatic to juice up the campaign. What are you hearing?
We hear this from time to time, and we do know that there was a period where some of the president's top advisors were talking about Nikki Haley. We've reported on that. I hear rumblings all the time about this. It is not a particularly comfortable place to be for Mike Pence as Donald Trump's vice president because of this dynamic. I mean, he knows full well what he has to do. It's sort of like being the press secretary. That audience of one is always watching. And, it's a concern. It's obviously a concern. I do think at this point, it would look like desperation to dump Mike Pence. It would look like you think that if you don't do something dramatic at this point, you're going to lose. It'll take on that kind of dimension. And I think is the flip side of taking that kind of step, that you put out a narrative that the house is on fire. And to a large extent, it is already on fire with this pandemic. The polls already indicate that. I mean, don't take it from me. So I think dumping Mike Pence overboard would only pour more gasoline on that fire.
I have a one-word question for you. Kanye?
Kanye. My kids were talking about this. They can't vote, so they're too young. But that goes to show you how it's penetrated and how people are paying attention to this. Kanye has said, if he pulls votes from Joe Biden, so be it. And he seems to know full well that he will do that. The question is whether or not he can put together a campaign and put together even a candidacy at this point and file the proper paperwork. I suppose that is something that we'll all be watching for to see if he does. But at this point, all he would do is be a spoiler. He would obviously siphon votes, I think, from Joe Biden. But is that enough to throw the presidency to Donald Trump? I don't know. Or does it just make you sort of national embarrassment, if you go ahead and do something like this? Do you become the butt of a joke if you throw your hat in the ring at this stage and become just sort of a celebrity candidate who, people look at it, they laugh, they shrug their shoulders, and they still go vote for one of the two main candidates at this point. So, you know, my sense of it is that he's maybe doing it for some publicity and wanted to shake things up a little bit. But, you know, the president and Kanye had a very, you know, pleasant exchange as far as we could tell when Kanye visited the White House. So, you know, we'll have to keep our eyes on that one. But you know, my sense of it is that that might backfire on him. And so we'll have to wait and see.
If President Trump doesn't win re-election, what do you think is in store between November 4th, 2020 and January 20th, 2021?
It's the, do we have to go in there and drag him out question. Yeah, you know, I think that there are a lot of different scenarios, some of which maybe we haven't talked about enough, but I was talking with a former White House official about this who was saying, you know, hold on to your hats. If he loses, there's a lot of different things that could happen. And, you know, things that we haven't maybe quite imagined or gamed out in print or online or, you know, even on social media. There's obviously the concern that he won't leave, but I think personally, I think that is, and I may, you know, if this is being recorded, I may have to eat this laptop and eat my words, but I don't think that he can feasibly like not leave the White House and, you know, we have some sort of armed standoff. I mean, who's going to come in and try to, you know, in the military, is the military going to come in and try to bail him out? You know, is that really going to happen? That sounds very far-fetched. I think that one of the things that you could see happen is, you know, the president may just decide that he wants to do a lot of dramatic things administratively that he wasn't able to do when he was worried about an election. So he could do some pretty draconian things with immigration. He could try to do some pretty draconian things with the environment and so on, where, you know, it takes people's breath away because, you know, it's like a kid in a candy store. He can just do whatever he wants because he's got the White House for a few months. But, you know, at that may be the point where the Republicans have the Howard Baker moment. You know, people were thinking that maybe the Howard Baker moment would have happened by now, but maybe that is when the Howard Baker moment would happen and Mitch McConnell would take a trip down to the White House and say, don't make us throw you out of office in the two months remaining that you have left. But I think that there's no question we could see a range of scenarios, many of them unsettling in what you're talking about, no question about it.
And this will be sort of my wrap-up question before we turn it over to questions. And I know there are a ton of them, Jim. If President Trump wins re-election, will you be covering the second Trump term?
My other favorite question. I don't know. I haven't made up my mind about that. I suppose that would be very tempting. I've given so many comprehensive answers at this point. Let me just dodge one and say, stay tuned. I don't know. I got to make up my mind on that one.
Well, listen, Jim, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you, and it's been so interesting. And with this, I'm giving Lisa and Megan, or at least Lisa, a few moments to get unmuted, perhaps, and turn on the camera, and make sure that she's got that big list of questions that I see are being typed in furiously, at least according to my scroll, which
as
is
David Letterman called it, viewer mail, right? Remember that?
Exactly. And there's Lisa. Good to see you, Lisa. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Kevin. I just want to remind people that, you know, there's going to be a link sent out, but Jim's book is available in paperback, New York Times bestseller. And as you know, there's also an audiobook that Jim recorded, and there's an ebook. So it's really an important book. It really documents this time. And Jim, thank you so much. And I just want to start by, I'm going to start with a question that came in previously, and then I have lots of questions that have been scrolling through. So this one comes from Chris Farrell of Berkshire Gas, and he's saying, with it being widely recognized that N95 masks offer relatively bulletproof protection against coronavirus, do we have any sense of why the Trump administration hasn't invoked the Defense Production Act to mandate large-scale production of these masks to make them widely available both to the medical community and to the general? I know that's something that Governor Cuomo was just driving home about every day during his daily press conferences as well.
Yeah, I mean, it is going to be one of the big questions when we look back on all of this as to why we weren't told by government officials to wear masks and face coverings from the beginning. And part of that is because I don't think even our top public health experts fully understood how this virus worked. And I think that is, you know, part of the learning process. And it's one of the reasons why we had to shut down as a country, because, you know, here we are, 132,000 people have died. What would that number be had we not shut down? What would that number be had we not embraced masks in large parts of the country? It would be much larger than that. People forget that over 600,000 people died during the 1918 flu at the you know, early part of the 20th century. We could be heading into that territory right now, and and what would our hospitals look like? What would our communities look like if we were thrown into that kind of you know, just hellfire? Damnation. I think it just would have been just an awful, awful thing for the world to see. But in terms of the gentleman's question about N95 masks, I do think at the very beginning of all of this, there was the big concern, and Dr. Fauci has talked about this, that had they tried to invoke the Defense Production Act or even just put an emphasis on producing those kinds of masks, that there was a fear among the policymakers that it would have deprived hospital workers of that kind of necessary medical equipment. So I do think one of the things that I've said to friends is somebody in authority like Dr. Fauci should record a video at some point and say, United States of America in the year 2120, if you have a deadly pandemic like COVID-19, here's what you do. And so they can just put the video on their laptops or whatever screens they're looking at that point, and it says, put on a damn mask at the very beginning of this entire process. And if you need to invoke the Defense Production Act to produce things on a massive scale, so we have it in place for hospitals and the community at large, do it. Spare no expense, do it. And I do think, as silly as that sounds, that is something that somebody needs to do for future generations. There needs to be a time capsule type of, in case of emergency, break glass, here's what you do. If something like this happens again. I do think some of this is just going to be hindsight is 2020, Lisa. I do think that they were so afraid of depriving these medical professionals of those masks that they swung too far in the other direction and didn't put an emphasis on that sort of thing at the beginning of all of this. And I think we're all going to look at that as one of the mistakes that was made at the beginning of this pandemic. And so it's a lesson learned. I think at the end of the day, it is just going to be a lesson learned. But you know, lots of lessons learned at this point, Lisa. As you know, you're in New York. Look what New York has done. They've just about flattened this curve. They bent this curve in ways that other states that will go unnamed at this point would dream to be able to see on a pie chart or a graph on CNN on the Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer. When we put those graphs on screen and you see states going up one after another and you see New York doing this, it's because they locked down, because they took this seriously, because people were listening to their public officials and trusting what was being said in the news media. I'm not saying everybody needs to be like New York State, but you could also be like what we've seen in Europe and parts of Asia, where you know, people paid attention to the authorities, people trusted what was happening and what was being said in the news media, and they responded accordingly, and they weren't demonizing one another and at each other's throats about putting on a mask in a grocery store. I mean, that's where we are in this country right now. We've gotten so whipped into a frenzy that we are at each other's throats over putting a mask on in the 7-Eleven. I mean, that to me is, it is just it's a mark of shame, I think, on our country that we have allowed ourselves to get to this point where we can't pull together and do what is necessary to end this pandemic, or at the very least blunt it to the point where we can go on with our lives.
So Myrna Feldman is asking a related question. She says, will the country ever be able to return to what had been baseline in all of the departments and agencies in government in Washington and in the world? And if so, how long do you think it might take?
I do think we're going to be somewhat in this place into the beginning of 2021. I think by the time a new president is inaugurated or Donald Trump is inaugurated for a second term. I think we'll still be in the throes of this pandemic. I do think the vaccine will either be on the market or on the verge of being on the market. But then we're going to have another debate. We're going to have people coming out of the woodwork saying you can't take a vaccine, or am I so manly that I don't need a vaccine, and so on, like we've seen with these masks. And until and unless we have leaders on the national level who are going to listen to the facts, listen to the science, and listen to the experts, and pass on that information to the American people in a way that is authoritative, but also respects people's individual liberties, we're going to have ourselves in a situation, I'm afraid, when a vaccine comes out where people are just not going to trust the vaccine, and they're not going to trust what's being said about this vaccine. And I think that's going to hold us back. And it's just going to be, it's just something that's unique to this country. A healthy fear of your government is a good thing. An unhealthy fear, I think, obviously can go too far and come back to haunt us and backfire against us. So I do think, to some extent, it is going to be like a red state, blue state problem until this vaccine is put out there in wide enough use to where we are really seeing it, stop infecting people. But I tell you, when you look at what's happening in Florida, Arizona, Texas, I know I was not going to mention states by name. I love all 50 states. I visited all 50 states. I love all 50 states. But there are certain states that are just not with the program. And we're just seeing the results of that. I mean, it's just obvious.
And on that thread, Maya Cummings is asking, would you characterize the impact of Trump's haphazard and grossly negligent response to the coronavirus as genocide?
No, I would not. I think that's probably taking things too far. That is taking things too far. I mean, I understand the frustration. I understand the anger that is out there, but I don't think this is being intentionally inflicted on people. So I think that's going too far. I do. Let's allow that kind of rhetoric to be in the domain of certain individuals. It doesn't need to be in the domain of all of us. You know what I mean? Like, we're going to have to all work together to lower the temperature and lower the rhetoric in this country if we're going to get to a place where we can beat this thing. I really do. I really think that that's the case.
Well, I do want to move to another thread, and Maya also is asking, given the direction of all the evidence, can we now safely say that Trump really is Putin's puppet?
We're getting into all the questions that I love to hear when I do these things in person. Listen, one of the reasons why I thought that this afterword was important in this book is because it tackles the Ukraine saga. And that was, again, another exhibit of this curious Russia question when it comes to President Trump. His supporters, his most ardent supporters, may say that's ridiculous, it's just a witch hunt, blah, blah, blah. But when the question keeps coming up over and over again, I do think it's legitimate for us to ask what's going on here. When Fiona Hill, the president's own Russia expert, is testifying before Congress that this notion that the Ukrainians were the ones who were meddling in the 2016 election is Kremlin propaganda, when she is saying that, I think that is something that people should take seriously. And when you have the situation in Helsinki, when we were all watching what happened in Helsinki, I was in the room that day for that press conference when the president of the United States said he takes the word of Vladimir Putin over his own intelligence community. That is a problem. When you have members of the campaign meeting with a Russian attorney during the 2016 campaign cycle, and that Russian attorney is saying, I'm here on behalf of the Kremlin. At each of these exits on the Russia meddling highway, we need to ask questions. And, when these things occur, we would be accused of journalistic malpractice. I would be able to hear Kevin in his offices at the Berkshire Eagle screaming from the top of his lungs, ask the question, ask the bloody question. Why aren't you asking about Russia? My God, Jim, what's wrong with you? His people from his campaign met with the attorney, and then you saw what happened with Helsinki, and then you saw what happened with Michael Flynn, and then you saw what happened with Ukraine, and why aren't you asking? So if rational thinking people like Kevin are sitting at home or in their offices wondering what's going on here, my goodness, I wouldn't be doing my job as a reporter if I wasn't asking these questions. But I do think you know, that you have a lingering unsolved mystery as to what is going on with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. I mean, I wrote about this in my book. I talked to a top national security official for the writing of this book who said, I can't put my finger on it. I wish I could put my finger on it. I can't tell you whether or not the president, the person I work for, was working always on behalf of the American people. What have we seen in the books that have come out since, John Bolton and so on? There have been worries at times among these officials as to what the president is doing. What is he up to? Why is he seemingly at times pursuing interests that are at odds with those of the United States and at times appear to be in line with his own personal interests? And I do think, as Lisa knows and Kevin knows and Megan knows, when you get up in the years a little bit like us, you do see history a little bit differently than perhaps younger people do. And, we understand that sometimes we don't get instant gratification. We don't have all of our questions answered when the guy is in office, when the person is in office. Sometimes we learn, what really was going on 5, 10, 15 years down the road. And I do think what Donald Trump should fear more than anything is history and what historians are going to say about what he was doing during this presidency, because he has no choice. As I wrote about in the book, unless we get rid of all the books and all the historians and everybody else, they can't outrun the truth. They can't outrun what we're eventually going to find out, which is why they should just treat us reporters with respect when they deal with us from the beginning, because, these are the questions that the American people have a right to have an answer to.
Don't you think, too, Jim, that the president's own actions, should he be turned out of office, will also be indicators of how he's been dealing with Russia and perhaps what foundations he's been laying?
Yeah, I do. And I do think at the end of the day, there's going to be a paper trail. There's going to be an email trail. There's going to be phone calls, phone records. There are going to be aides to foreign leaders who are going to speak at some point, who are going to help us piece together a lot of these different questions. I think the Russian bounty story is one that, it is going to take some time to ferret out, but the truth behind that is going to come out. And, listen, if there was detailed advanced knowledge that this was going on for months and months and months, and people at the highest levels of government weren't doing anything about it, there's going to be hell to pay. There's just going to be hell to pay. And people are going to demand that. And you can pull me out of the equation. You can pull Peter Alexander out of the equation. You can pull all of my colleagues out of the equation who are not seen as acceptable to the administration. And you're still going to have reporters digging. You're still going to have the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, and everybody trying to get at what was going on with these bounties, what was going on with this relationship with Putin, what was going on with this relationship with Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudis, and why is it we don't fully understand what happened with Jamal Khashoggi. And these are questions that are just going to take time, and we're not going to, it's not the ABC afternoon special that everything gets solved at the end of the hour. It just doesn't work that way.
So
Forgive me for dating myself there.
That's okay. There's so many questions from our viewers. George is asking, why are the Republicans in Congress so afraid to challenge him?
Yeah, I mean, it's as basic as his Twitter feed. They kind of all, hang around their Twitter feeds waiting for the president to say nice things or bad things about them. And it is sort of a sad commentary on where we are as a country when they're that invested in what he is saying on Twitter. But he has found an effective tool for keeping a party under control in the way that FDR had his fireside chats, in the way that John F. Kennedy commanded the power of television, in the ways that the Clinton administration and the Obama administration began to utilize the internet, and to some extent with Barack Obama's social media. Donald Trump has turned Twitter into a political weapon, and he knows how to keep those folks in line in his party in ways that I don't think we've been able to fully appreciate. Is it as sad as, oh, they're afraid he's going to say a mean tweet about him? Okay, that might be too simplistic about it. But he commands a base that can't be denied. That is, you know, that could make the difference. If he is to win re-election and the polls are wrong again, it is because of the enthusiasm gap that exists between the Republican and Democratic candidate. I do think if Joe Biden has something to worry about and work on between now and November 3rd, it is this enthusiasm question. And you know, Donald Trump can retweet videos of boaters out on the bay, you know, with their Trump flags flying from their boats. Joe Biden can't do that, you know, and you know, should you put a lot of stock in that? Okay, maybe not, but it does show, and I've seen this firsthand because I go to the rallies, that, you know, Donald Trump commands a very enthusiastic base. That base can be turned against people inside of his own party, and they know that, and they respond accordingly.
I think this one goes to your own temperament, and this is from Jeff, and he says, how do you keep your composure when the president points to you and says, you're a terrible reporter and you're news? How do you not just get ballistic about it?
Oh, I just do this. I just, you know, just brush it off. You know, I played baseball and football growing up. You never wanted to go into the locker room with a clean jersey and clean pants. It's nice to go in with a little dirt on your uniform. Listen, if they're not coming at you a little bit, you're not doing your job right. I think one of the things that I try to do is I think about it this way. I think about the questions that people want to ask at home. Like I was joking about with Kevin earlier about this Russia question. If I didn't ask that question, if I didn't ask those questions in the sharpest way possible, there are going to be people at home who are going to say, boy, that Jim, he is such a, you know, what is he, why is he even there? You know, is he there to play patty cake? Why, you know, this is not the playground. This is serious stuff. This is the White House. You need to hold their feet to the fire. And one of the things that our fellow Americans inside Trump world, what they lose sight of is that we're not just here to do the news for them. We're not just here to do the news in a way that makes them satisfied or say, aha, you know, getting their blessing is not like on my priority list. I don't really care. I do care that we have people across the political spectrum who feel like they're getting their money's worth, who feel like they're getting out of us what they should get out of us. And, you know, if I were doing things in a way where I was, you know, being the lapdog to this administration or that administration, I wouldn't be able to live with myself. That is why, you know, when Obama was in office, they would get tired of me too. It's part of what we do. And I tell people all the time, if you want to be liked, go be a veterinarian. Because, you know, if you want to be liked, being a journalist is not a surefire way of accomplishing that. That is not going to work out too well for you.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Joe Biden. We have a question from David Rempel, and he says, what do you think of the idea that Biden is refusing to debate Trump unless Trump releases all of his financial information, similar to what Biden released? And then I'm just curious about your thoughts. I know that you spent a lot of time with Joe Biden, who's the vice president, and you covered the entire administration. So after that.
Yeah, I mean, not to toot my own horn, but, you know, I was able to break the story when Joe Biden said in 2015 that he didn't have the emotional fuel to run for president. You know, he said it on a conference call with members of the Democratic Party, and it was because of the death of his son. It was such a body blow that he just felt like he didn't have it in him to run for president. You know, one of the things that I think can be argued is that had Joe Biden run for president in 2016, yes, he may have been defeated by Hillary Clinton in the primaries, but I don't know if that's necessarily the case. And I do think that Biden just matches up better with Donald Trump than Hillary Clinton does. And I suppose they can throw all the fresh produce they have at me for that one. But I do think that, you know, in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Ohio and Wisconsin, those are states where Joe Biden is just going to perform better than Hillary Clinton. I do think, to the other part of your question as to, what do I make of Joe Biden's threat not to debate if Donald Trump doesn't reveal his financial records? I mean, that is a clever thing for them to say right now, and it's amusing. And I suppose, they can drive a couple of news cycles with that sort of thing. They're not going to be able to avoid being in a presidential debate with Donald Trump, nor do I think they want to. I mean, Hillary Clinton arguably won all three presidential debates, but Donald Trump won the presidency. So they are not always as pivotal as everybody thinks. But I do think it would give Joe Biden the chance especially if this pandemic is still going on, to be face to face with the president and say, why didn't you do more to protect the American people during this pandemic? And I don't think you have to have a zinger. You don't need to have a you're no Jack Kennedy kind of moment. I think you can just very coldly and plainly say, you just didn't get the job done, and I wonder if he would be missing a moment if he didn't do that. I don't know if, I mean, we've seen a portion of Donald Trump's taxes come out, and they basically confirmed what we already knew. So if you had years and years of his tax records, yes, you might be able to see where certain loans came in or where he was financially compromised here and there, but maybe not. And, to have that kind of, carrot and stick approach to the debates, I wonder if he might be sacrificing something that perhaps didn't merit it.
Sarah Iglesias is asking, as someone who has observed the administration more than most, what scares you the most about the administration?
Wow, that's a tough question. It's a tough question in that, using the word scare makes it sound like I'm just rendering a judgment overall about the administration. But what worries me is the demonization of the press, obviously. We can't have a situation like that, but I've talked about that quite a lot during this discussion. One of the things that I wanted to write about in this book, and one of the reasons why I'm glad Lisa gave me this opportunity and HarperCollins gave me the opportunity and CNN gave me the opportunity to write this book, is I wanted to write about the subject of immigration. There was that exchange I had with Stephen Miller in the White House briefing room, where they were trying to talk about limiting legal immigration into this country, and lo and behold, look what they're trying to do with the pandemic. They're using it as a device, as a way to do what they want with immigration anyway. But they were trying to do it back in 2017, and I asked Stephen Miller, well, what about the Statute of Liberty? What about what it says on the Statute of Liberty? Give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. What about that sentiment? I know it's not the law of the land. I know we don't write laws based on what's inscribed on the Statute of Liberty. But what about that sentiment that we all have ingrained in us, that we are all one people, that e pluribus unum matters? And I don't think he had a great answer for that. And I think that was exposed that day. And I think it exposed a problem that they've had from the very beginning in all of this. And that is, part of the greatness of the United States of America, and people might be a little down in the dumps right now because of what's going on, is that we've always welcomed newcomers to this country. And I know there's a whole other dimension to that conversation with Black Lives Matter and so on, and that is a worthy discussion. I wish we had hours and hours to discuss it here. But in the context of immigration, my father's a Cuban refugee. He came to this country in 1962, right before the Cuban Missile Crisis. He told me the story. I write about it in the book about it. When he was growing up in Northern Virginia, he was only 11 years old, and how a teacher would pull him aside and teach him how to read and write English. There was no president at the time demonizing immigrants and calling them rapists and killers. John F. Kennedy, just about every president before him and every president after him, was about welcoming immigrants to this country. And what worries me so much about what I've seen over these last 3 years is that we've seen a demonization of people who are not white, who may not be named Smith or Johnson or can trace their roots back to the American Revolution. But yet what's always had sort of a regenerating effect in this country, a life-giving effect in this country, is the fact that we bring in all of these wonderful people from all over the world. And yes, they may not be on top of the world when they get here, but they have the opportunity to do so when they get to the United States. And I do think there is a certain magic to that. People call it American exceptionalism, but that term has been politicized and so on. Pull that out of the equation. I do think that there is something special about the fact that we allow people to come into this country and try to make it on their own and make a better life for themselves here and their children here than the one that they left behind. My dad, growing up in Cuba, was running around barefoot like a farmer kid, outside of Havana in Cuba. They had nothing. And on top of that, people in Cuba don't have democratic freedoms. They don't have freedom of the press. They don't have the freedom to protest their government and so on. I think about that too. But it's the way I think we welcome immigrants into this country, that worries me right now, because there's been a demonization of immigrants, a demonization of those who don't maybe resemble folks who can trace their roots back to the American Revolution. That is I think that is a road to darkness, and I think that is a one-way ticket to unraveling something wonderful that our parents and grandparents and generations before them have been able to put together in this country, and that is the greatest, most prosperous society that's ever been created. And I don't think we should be pulling at, parts of that willy-nilly and expecting things to be able to hold together. Okay, I do think that there's a danger to that.
So you mentioned Stephen Miller, and Jessica is asking, the president often shoots from the hip, but clearly someone is doing the planning and the writing of the speeches in the scripted settings, i.e. his visit to the church during the protests, or planning an appearance on a date designed to emphasize the opposite of what is being commemorated. Is it Stephen Miller or someone else pulling the strings? And then she goes on to say, certainly Jared Kushner is too busy.
Well, Jared is involved in a lot of these decisions. Mark Meadows is involved in a lot of these decisions. Stephen Miller is always there. He's certainly a part of this process. Mike Pence is as well. There are congressional leaders that the president consults with who are part of this process. The president's family is a very big factor in all of this. I had a senior White House official tell me, and I write about this in the book, that Jared and Ivanka are the chiefs of staff. You can change the chief of staff as many times as you would like, but they're essentially the chiefs of staff in this White House. One of the points that I made, and I was there at the White House that day when the military trucks were rolling through, like something out of Tiananmen Square, to set up in Lafayette Square to put down and push out those protesters by St. John's Episcopal Church. And one of the points that I made that day, and I think it's something that people need to reflect on, is it's not just Donald Trump going out there and saying these things and then the things just magically happen, carrying out what he wants done. You have taxpayer-funded employees of the federal government who are also carrying out these orders and instructions. And one of the things that people who work for him have to think about, and I do think some of them think about it because that's why they've left. Some of them have left for these reasons, is that you have to do some hard thinking. What is more important? The person who is in that office for a brief period of time when it relates to the course of our history, or does your country matter the most? And I do think that's why we have seen from time to time with Jim Mattis here, to some extent John Bolton, although that's probably a bad example. He had a chance to make a difference at a critical moment. He passed on that. There have been moments where some of these folks who have worked for him have come out and said, listen, this is what I saw, this is what went down, this is a problem. There haven't been enough of them. And I do think that time and history will judge people harshly. If they had a chance to come out and say, this is what was happening, this is what was going on behind the scenes, this is where we let the American people down, and they didn't speak about it when they had the chance, I think history is going to judge them harshly. And I do think that that's something that has to be thought about, because he can't do all of this on his own. The president can't do all of these things on his own. He has to have people behind him carrying out these things in order for them to happen.
So I just want to move on to, we have a number of students have posted their questions, and journalism students. Nicole is a college student from the University of Minnesota, and she's asking what tips you have for aspiring journalists. How do you get through the tough days?
Ooh. And maybe this could be, I kind of feel like we need to build up to that. Here's where this is where I wrap things up in a poetic way. But, one of the things that I think young journalists need to think about is, and here, please, I'm no Professor Acosta here, but one of the things I think people need to think about is, are they just a journalist? Or are they just there to write down the politicians' words? Are they just there to tell us what happened? Or are they there for something more? And one of the things that I have wrestled with, and I've tried to live up to while I've been covering this White House, is that I do think we're there for something more. And when there are key institutions, when there are segments of our society that are under attack, I call it in the book a question of what would you do? And you have to answer that question yourself. But there will be a moment in, you know, that person's life as a young journalist who's asking the question where they're going to have to make that decision. And I think what you have to tell yourself at that moment is, you know, why am I here? Am I here just to write the story? Or am I here for something more? That doesn't mean you're supposed to like insert your opinion and tell people what you think happened and so on. But I do think you have to bring to your job a certain level of passion and understanding that you are not just doing this job for yourself, for your bank account, for the number of followers you have on Twitter. You're doing this job for the readers, the viewers, the listeners, the people who are receiving your information and counting on you to get this right and to be tough. Because we are, as journalists, we are there on American people's behalf. That's why I describe it at the end of the hardcover version of my book. You know, I see us as defenders of people, you know, and that may sound corny or quaint or something from a time long gone. But I do think that if you think of yourself in that fashion, you'll probably err on the right side of things more often than not, that you'll make more right decisions than bad decisions. We're all going to make mistakes as journalists, no question about it. I've made my share. But if you go into it with the right mentality, that you're not just there for yourself, then I think you're going to be doing good work.
Well, on that note, you've been doing great work. I just am reminding everyone, since we've talked about it a bunch, the enemy of the people, a dangerous time to tell the truth in America. You've been telling the truth tonight. You've been telling the truth for decades and now, and we really appreciate your participation, and everyone from the folks at OLLI, at BCC, Berkshire Community College, and the Berkshire Eagle, and the gas company and all of that. We just thank you tremendously for this illuminating COVID night in with Jim Acosta, who spent a lot of time getting swabbed so he can get inside that White House briefing room and ask.
Yes, I have. This is true.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Lisa Sharkey. Thank you, Kevin Moran and the wonderful Berkshire Eagle. Support your local newspaper. Thank you to Berkshire Gas for sponsoring us. And also thank you to Pittsfield Community Television for broadcasting this so people without internet can also enjoy it. Everyone have a good night, and please continue to have thoughtful conversations together. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe. Wear a mask.
Good night.
Night.